The air inside White's club tasted of stale cigars, spilled brandy, and the quiet desperation of ruined men. It was a sanctuary built for the elite of London, a fortress of mahogany and leather, where
The
fortunes were
council
made
has
and
spoken.
lost
You have
between
our
the
trust.
ticking of a
I
grandfather clock
understand. I will
and
not
the
fail.
clatter of ivory dice. But
I
tonight
accept your
the
terms,
atmosphere was
Alistair.
not
I
one
will
of
not fail you.
gentlemanly leisure. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of the slaughter.
I
At the
do.
center table beneath
I
the
do.
glare of a
With this
massive
kiss,
crystal
I thee wed.
chandelier sat Lord Reginald Hawley. His face was the color of old parchment. His hands resting on the green baize of the gaming table trembled so violently that the heavy gold signet ring on his finger rattled against the wood. He was a man who had spent his life chasing the ghost of prosperity, and tonight he had finally caught up with his own destruction. Across from him sat Lord Malachi Vance. Vance was a man who wore his cruelty like a tailored suit. He did not gamble for money. He gambled for the sheer intoxicating power of watching another man break. He leaned back in his velvet chair, swirling the amber liquid in his crystal glass, his dark eyes fixed on the trembling wreck of the man before him. The promissory notes were piled high in the center of the table. The Hawley estate in Kent, the townhouse in Mayfair, the family silver, the carriages, every horse in the stables. It was all gone. "Your credit is exhausted, Reginald," Vance said. His voice was smooth, carrying the oily cadence of a predator who had finally cornered his prey. "You have nothing left to wager. The game is over." Lord Hawley swallowed hard. A bead of sweat traced a path down his hollow cheek. "Give me one more line of credit, Malachi, just one. My investments in the East India Company, they will yield returns by spring. I swear it." Vance smiled. It was a terrible, bloodless thing. "Your investments are as worthless as your promises. You are a bankrupt man. However," Vance leaned forward, placing his forearms on the table. The surrounding gentlemen men of immense wealth and power leaned in as well. This was the blood sport they had come to see. The unspoken rule of the club was absolute non-interference. Ruin was a private matter to be observed but never interrupted. "However," Vance repeated, his voice dropping to a low conspiratorial murmur, "there is one asset you have not yet placed upon the table, an asset of considerable beauty." Lord Hawley's eyes widened in horror. "No, you cannot mean." "Your daughter," Vance said, the words sliding off his tongue like venom. "Miss Seraphina Hawley, 23, unmarried, a bit too sharp-tongued for most men's tastes, but I have always appreciated a challenge. Write the draft, Reginald. Transfer her guardianship and hand in marriage to me, and I will clear this table. Every debt forgiven, every deed returned." The silence in the room became absolute. Men who had wagered thousands of pounds without blinking suddenly found it difficult to breathe. This was not a wager. This was human trafficking so draped in the polite fiction of a gentleman's agreement. It was an utter betrayal of the natural order, a father selling his own blood to save his pride. Hawley stared at the paper Vance pushed toward him. A quill was set beside it. The inkwell looked black as an abyss. Hawley's hand shook as he reached for the feather. Then a sound cut through the suffocating quiet. The heavy brass handles of the club's private parlor doors turned. It was an impossible sound. No one entered this room uninvited. But the doors swung open with a smooth, decisive force, and standing in the threshold was a figure that defied every rule of London society. It was a woman. Seraphina Hawley stepped into the den of wolves. She did not wear the pale silks or delicate lace of a young woman seeking a husband. She wore a tailored riding habit of deep charcoal gray, entirely unadorned, buttoned to the throat like armor. Her dark hair was pinned back with severe precision, but it was her face that commanded the room. She was not weeping. She was not trembling. Her jaw was set in a line of pure, unadulterated iron, and her eyes, the color of a stormy sea, swept across the room with the cold, calculating gaze of a military commander assessing a battlefield. She walked past the astonished lords, her boots clicking softly against the polished hardwood floor, until she stood directly behind her father's chair. "Put the quill down, father," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it possessed a resonant clarity that cut through the smoke-filled air like a blade. Hawley dropped the feather as if it had burned him. "Seraphina, you cannot be here. This is no place for you. And yet I find myself here because the man entrusted with protecting our family is currently negotiating the price of my soul," she replied evenly. She did not look at her Esther. Her gaze was locked entirely on Lord Malachi Vance. Vance's initial shock gave way to a slow, triumphant grin. Miss Hawley, how delightfully unconventional of you to join us. We were just discussing your future. You were discussing a transaction, Lord Vance, Serafina countered, her tone devoid of fear. A transaction based on the premise that I am a piece of property to be traded for gambling markers. I assure you I am not. The law of England dictates otherwise, my dear, Vance sneered, tapping the unwritten contract. Your father's debts are absolute. If he does not sign this, he goes to debtor's prison, and you will find yourself working as a scullery maid in the East End before the month is out. I am offering you salvation. You are offering me a cage, she stated, her posture perfectly rigid. And you, father, you would truly sign it. You would sell my loyalty to a man who possesses none. The tragedy of the moment hung heavy in the air. Here was a woman of fierce intellect, a woman who read law and philosophy while the rest of her peers practiced needlepoint, reduced to a bargaining chip on a felt table. She stood alone against the entire machinery of the British aristocracy, armed with nothing but her own dignity. I have no choice, Serafina. Hawley whispered brokenly, burying his face in his hands. Vance picked up the quill and held it out to the broken man. Sign it, Hawley. The hour grows late. Serafina did not close her eyes. She did not turn away. She forced herself to watch the ultimate betrayal, her mind already calculating how she would survive the aftermath. She would not let Vance break her. She would outlive him. She would outsmart him. She drew a slow, steady breath, preparing for the gavel to fall. He will sign nothing. The voice came from the shadows near the fireplace. It was a voice that did not ask for attention. It commanded it. It was deep, gravelly, and carried the unmistakable weight of absolute authority. Every head in the room turned. From the darkness stepped a man who seemed to lower the temperature of the room just by entering it. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in immaculate, unforgiving black. His hair was dark, threaded with premature streaks of silver at the temples, brushing the collar of his coat in a way that spoke of a man who had long ceased to care about the trivialities of fashion. But it was his face that made men step back. It was a face carved from granite, striking and harsh, bearing a faint, pale scar that ran along his jawline. His eyes were a piercing, icy blue, holding the distant thousand-yard stare of a man who had seen the absolute worst of humanity and had returned entirely unfazed by it. He was Alistair Montgomery, the Duke of Ravenscroft. In the financial districts of London, they called him the Iron Duke. He was a veteran of the Crimean War, a man who had led cavalry charges into artillery fire and survived. He had returned to England not to partake in the frivolous waltzes of the season, but to build a financial empire that rivaled the crown itself. He was feared, respected, and entirely isolated. He walked slowly toward the table. The crowd of gentlemen parted for him instinctively, like water yielding to the prow of a dreadnought. He did not look at Lord Hawley. He did not look at Vance. His icy blue eyes were fixed entirely on Serafina. For a fraction of a second, the Duke and the ruined daughter held each other's gaze. In her eyes, Alistair did not see the panic of a trapped animal. He saw the cold, rational calculus of a survivor. He saw a mind that mirrored his own. Alistair stopped at the edge of the table. He looked down at the pile of markers and then finally shifted his gaze to Lord Vance. Montgomery, Vance said, his voice losing a fraction of its smooth confidence. This is a private table. The matter is resolved. The matter is an atrocity, Alistair said quietly. The quietness of his voice made it infinitely more dangerous. And it is far from resolved. Alistair reached into the inner pocket of his coat. He withdrew a thick, leather-bound ledger. He opened it, retrieved a single crisp sheet of bank paper, and laid it directly over the unwritten contract of marriage. £20,000, Alistair stated. The collective intake of breath in the room was audible. It was a staggering sum, an imperial ransom. It was enough to buy the Hawley estate 3 times over. Vance stared at the draft, his jaw tightening. Greed warred with his desire for dominance. You intend to clear his debts. Your grace, out of what charity? The Iron Duke is not known for his philanthropy. I am not a philanthropist, Alistair replied, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. I am a businessman. I am purchasing the debt. The Hawley estate, the townhouse, the markers. They belong to me now. Vance's eyes narrowed into slits. And the girl you think to buy the daughter as well, to take my prize. The atmosphere snapped. The insult was blatant. Alistair did not raise his voice. He did not reach for the walking stick that concealed a steel blade. He simply leaned down, placing both hands flat on the table, bringing his face level with Vance's. "Do not ever refer to her as a prize again," Alistair said softly. The menace in his tone was absolute. It was the voice of a man who had ordered artillery strikes. "You are a predator, Vance. You feed on the weak because you lack the intellect to compete with the strong. You hold leveraged debt in 3 different shipping firms that are currently anchored in Liverpool, unable to move cargo due to the strikes. Strikes that my companies are funding. Your liquidity is an illusion. If you do not take this money and walk away from this table right now, I will personally dismantle your financial holdings before the stock exchange opens tomorrow morning. I will leave you with nothing but the clothes on your back." Vance turned pale. The smugness evaporated, replaced by the stark realization that he had brought a knife to a cannon fight. He looked at the bank draft, then at the Duke's unyielding eyes. With a jerky, humiliated motion, Vance snatched the draft from the table, grabbed his walking stick, and stormed out of the room, the door slamming behind him. The silence returned. The spectators stood frozen. Alistair stood up slowly, straightening his coat. He picked up the pile of Hawley's gambling markers. With deliberate, precise movements, he walked over to the roaring fireplace. He tossed the entire stack of markers into the flames. The paper curled, blackened, and turned to ash. Lord Hawley collapsed forward onto the table, sobbing in sheer pathetic relief. "Your Grace, my lord, you have saved me. You have saved my family. How can I ever repay you?" Alistair turned his back on the fire. He looked at Hawley with profound disgust. "You will not repay me, Hawley. You will return to your home. You will never set foot in a gaming hall again. If you do, I will ensure you are exiled to the continent." Alistair then turned his attention back to Serafina. She had not moved. She had watched the entire display of raw power with an analytical stillness. She was not crying tears of gratitude. She was studying him, trying to decipher the mechanics of the trap she assumed she had just stepped into. "Miss Hawley," Alistair said, addressing her directly for the first time. "Your Grace," she replied, her voice steady. "You have purchased my family's debts. By the laws of this society, you now own our properties and our future. What is it you require in return?" She asked the question like a lawyer cross-examining a hostile witness. She expected him to demand exactly what Vance had demanded. Her body, her subservience, her destruction. Alistair looked into her storm-gray eyes. He saw the defensive walls she had built, walls so thick and high they mirrored the barricades in his own mind. "I require a wife," Alistair said simply. A ripple of shock went through the remaining gentlemen, but Alistair ignored them. He stepped closer to her, lowering his voice so that only she could hear the next words. "I do not want a trophy. I do not want a submissive creature who will agree with my every word. I want a partner. I want a woman who has the courage to walk into a room full of men and demand justice. I will call upon you tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock to discuss the terms of our marriage. Good evening, Miss Hawley." He bowed to her, a deep, formal bow of absolute respect. Not a bow given to a conquered debtor, but a bow given to an equal. Then he turned and walked out of the club, leaving the scent of smoke and the shattered remnants of the old order in his wake. Serafina stood completely still. The man known as the Iron Duke had just leveled a financial empire to protect her, burned her father's debts to ash, and offered her a partnership. For the first time in her life, she did not know what to expect. But as she looked at the dying embers in the fireplace, a strange, unfamiliar sensation took root in her chest. It wasn't fear. It was the sudden, sharp thrill of intellectual anticipation. The following morning in Mayfair was overcast, a heavy gray sky pressing down on the elegant townhouses. Inside the Hawley residence, the atmosphere was fraught with a frantic, nervous energy. Lord Hawley paced the drawing room, his hands trembling as he checked his pocket watch for the 4th time. He was a man who had narrowly escaped the gallows, and he was terrified of offending the executioner who had spared him. Serafina sat perfectly still in a high-backed armchair near the window. She wore a simple, structured dress of deep navy blue, her posture immaculate, her hands folded quietly in her lap. She had not slept. She had spent the night in her father's study reviewing every piece of legislation regarding property rights, marital law, and the entailment of estates. If she was to enter into a contract with the most formidable man in England, she would not do so unarmed. At precisely 10 o'clock, the heavy knocker on the front door sounded. A moment later, the butler opened the drawing room doors. "His Grace, the Duke of Ravenscroft," the butler announced, his voice carrying a tremor of awe. Alistair Montgomery walked into the room. In the harsh light of day, the severity of his features was even more pronounced. He wore no frivolous cravat, no embroidered waistcoat. His attire was immaculate, tailored black wool that spoke of utility and immense wealth. He carried a silver-tipped walking stick, resting his weight on it just slightly, a phantom ache from a musket ball taken at the Alma. Lord Hawley practically fell over himself, rushing forward. "Your Grace, welcome to our home. I cannot begin to express the depths of my gratitude for your intervention last night. I am entirely at your service." Alistair did not take the offered hand. He looked at Lord Hawley with a cold, dissecting stare. "You misunderstand the nature of my visit, Hawley. I did not come here to receive your gratitude. I came here to speak with your daughter." Alistair's gaze shifted to Seraphina. "Privately." Hawley blinked, stuttering. "Privately, but your Grace, propriety demands—" "Propriety died the moment you attempted to sell her to Malachi Vance." Alistair cut him off, his voice like the crack of a whip. "Leave us." Hawley withered under the command. He bowed hastily and scurried out of the room, closing the heavy mahogany doors behind him. The silence that followed was dense, but it was not the terrifying silence of the gambling hall. It was the charged electric silence of two formidable minds sizing each other up. Alistair walked slowly across the room, taking a seat in the chair opposite Seraphina. He rested his hands on the head of his walking stick and looked at her. He did not let his gaze wander. He looked directly into her eyes, granting her the dignity of his full attention. "You look well prepared, Miss Hawley," he noted quietly. "When one is facing a titan of industry—" "Your Grace, one does not arrive without a strategy," Seraphina replied evenly. A faint, almost imperceptible shadow of a smile touched the corner of Alistair's mouth. "Good. I despise false modesty. Let us dispense with the pleasantries and speak of the reality of our situation. You understand why I am here." "You require a wife," she stated, echoing his words from the night before. "And I am a convenient asset. My reputation is respectable. My family is now entirely beholden to you, and I possess no male relative strong enough to challenge whatever terms you dictate." Alistair leaned back slightly. "Your assessment of the tactical advantages is accurate. However, your assessment of my motives is flawed. I did not purchase your debt to acquire a subservient asset." "Then why," she challenged, leaning forward just an inch, "you are the Duke of Ravenscroft. You could walk into Almack's tonight and choose from a dozen daughters of dukes and earls' women who have been bred since birth to manage an estate, throw lavish parties, and smile on command. Why choose the ruined daughter of a gambling addict?" Alistair looked away for a moment, his gaze drifting to the window. The gray light caught the silver in his hair. When he spoke, his voice carried the heavy, weary weight of a man who had lived too much. "Because I have no use for a woman who has only known the safety of drawing rooms," he said softly. "I have seen the world strip away the veneer of civilization, Miss Hawley. I have commanded men in the freezing mud of the Crimea. I have watched the old aristocracy fail because they understand protocol, but they do not understand survival. When you walked into that club last night, you did not ask for mercy. You demanded justice. You looked Malachi Vance in the eye and refused to break." He turned his gaze back to her, and the intensity in his blue eyes was arresting. "I live in a world of sycophants and predators. I need someone who can see through the performance. I need a mind capable of analyzing a threat and neutralizing it. I need an ally. I need a partner." The word hung in the air between them. Partner. Not a ward, not a possession, not a decorative fixture. Seraphina's breath hitched just slightly. It was the most profound compliment she had ever received, and it was delivered with the cold precision of a legal briefing. She felt a sudden, fierce respect for the man sitting across from her. "A partnership implies a negotiation of terms," she said, her voice steadying, "and it implies that both parties have the right to make demands." Alistair nodded slowly. "State your terms." Seraphina did not hesitate. She had rehearsed this in the dark hours of the morning. "First, my brother Thomas. He is currently at Eton. His education will not be interrupted. You will fund his schooling and provide him with a commission in a respectable regiment when he comes of age so that he is never dependent on the whims of our father." "Agreed," Alistair said instantly. "Second," she continued, her voice gaining strength, "my father is never to have access to the principal of whatever allowance you provide him. The funds must be managed by an independent solicitor, distributed monthly, to ensure he cannot gamble away his livelihood. A prudent measure. It shall be done. The solicitor will report directly to you." Serafina blinked, momentarily surprised by the concession of power. She gathered herself and pressed on to the most difficult condition. "Third, my autonomy. I will not be locked away in the country as a broodmare. If I am to be your duchess, I expect to be informed of the management of the estates. I expect to be useful." Alistair studied her for a long moment. The silence stretched. Serafina braced herself, wondering if she had pushed too far. The men of his era did not share power. They wielded it exclusively. Slowly, Alistair reached inside his coat. He withdrew a heavy brass key and placed it on the small table between them. "This," Alistair said, his voice dropping an octave, "is the key to the main archive room at Ravenscroft Hall. It contains the ledgers, the shipping manifests, the legal contracts, and the investment portfolios of the entire Montgomery estate. It is the nerve center of my empire. When we arrive in the country, you will take possession of it. You will review the ledgers. You will find the inefficiencies. You will assist me in managing the empire." Serafina stared at the brass key. It was not a piece of jewelry. It was not a token of affection. It was raw, unadulterated power. It was an acknowledgement of her intellect and validation of the thousands of hours she had spent reading in the shadows, while the world ignored her. She looked up from the key to the Duke. "You would trust me with this. You barely know me." "I know that you stood in a room full of wolves and did not blink," Alistair replied softly. "Trust is not given, Serafina. It is forged. We will forge it." He used her given name, and the sound of it on his lips sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. It was not said with intimacy, but with a profound grounding respect. "There is one final matter," Alistair said, his tone shifting, becoming slightly more guarded. "The matter of our personal arrangement." Serafina stiffened. This was the inevitable reality of the bargain. The duty of the marriage bed. She lifted her chin, preparing to accept the clinical reality of her fate. "I understand my duties, Your Grace. I am prepared to fulfill them." Alistair's jaw tightened. A flash of something dark and painful passed behind his eyes. He leaned forward, his massive frame dominating the space, but his demeanor was entirely devoid of aggression. "You understand nothing of the sort," he said, his voice a low, rough whisper. "Listen to me very carefully, Serafina. You have been backed into a corner by men who view you as currency. You are agreeing to this marriage because you have the strategic mind to recognize it is your only viable option to save your family. I will not compound that trauma by demanding your body as part of this transaction." Serafina's eyes widened. She stared at him, entirely disarmed. "We will be married by special license at the end of the week," Alistair continued, his tone resolute. "You will take my name. You will wear my ring. You will be the Duchess of Ravenscroft in the eyes of God and the law. But when the doors to our chambers close, you will have your own space, your own sanctuary. I will not cross your threshold. I will not lay a hand upon you out of duty or obligation or the assertion of marital right. I need a partner, Serafina. I do not need a prisoner." The absolute honor of the man struck her with the force of a physical blow. In a society that normalized the subjugation of women, this man, the most powerful, ruthless titan in London, was handing her the ultimate shield. He was giving her agency. For the first time since the ordeal began, Serafina felt the prick of tears behind her eyes. Not tears of fear, but tears of a profound, shattering relief. She quickly suppressed them, determined to meet his honor with her own strength. She reached out and picked up the heavy brass key. Her fingers closed tightly around the cold metal. She met his gaze, her stormy eyes clear and resolute. "I accept your terms, Alistair," she said, using his given name, sealing the pact. "I will be your duchess. I will be your ally. I will not fail you." Alistair looked at her, his scarred face softening by a fraction of an inch. "I know you will not," he murmured. He stood up, towering over her, and bowed once more. "I will make the arrangements. I will send my carriage for you on Friday morning." He turned and walked toward the door. Just as his hand touched the brass handle, Serafina spoke again. Your Grace. He paused, looking back over his shoulder. Thank you, she said quietly. Not for the money, for the respect. Alistair held her gaze for a long second. The ghosts of his past, the screams of the artillery, the endless betrayals of his life seemed to quiet just as little in the presence of this remarkable woman. You earned it, Serafina, he said. And then he was gone. 4 days later, beneath the soaring pale stone arches of St. George's Church in Hanover Square, the bargain was executed. London society thrived on spectacle, but there was none to be found that morning. There was no choir, no cascading floral arrangements, no pews packed with gossiping aristocrats. It was a cold, efficient, and deeply private affair. The only witnesses were Lord and Lady Hawley, standing nervously to the side, and a few of the Duke's most trusted solicitors. Serafina walked down the long empty aisle. She did not wear traditional white. She wore a gown of rich, deep emerald silk, structured and elegant, devoid of frivolous lace. She walked alone, having gently but firmly refused her father's arm. She would not be given away by the man who had tried to sell her. She would walk into this alliance under her own power. Waiting for her at the altar was Alistair. He stood perfectly still, hands clasped behind his back in a military stance. He wore a dark morning coat, his silver-streaked hair catching the dim light filtering through the stained glass. As she approached, his piercing blue eyes locked onto hers, analyzing her, anchoring her. There was no warmth in the cavernous church, but as Serafina stepped up beside him, she felt the undeniable heat radiating from his massive frame. He was a solid, immovable object in a world that had felt entirely unstable. The vicar, a frail man who seemed intimidated by the sheer presence of the Duke, began the liturgy. His voice echoed thinly against the stone walls. Dearly beloved, we are gathered together here in the sight of God. Serafina listened to the ancient words, words designed for love matches and romantic ideals, feeling the surreal weight of the moment. She was tying her life, her future, her very identity, to a man who was essentially a stranger. A man rumored to be as cold as the Russian winter he had fought in. Yet when he had looked at her in her drawing room, he had seen her mind. Wilt thou have this woman to thy wedded wife? Alistair did not hesitate. His voice rang out deep and resonant, filling the empty church with absolute certainty. I will. Wilt thou have this man to thy wedded husband? Serafina looked up at the scarred, hard lines of his face. She thought of the brass key sitting securely in her reticule. She thought of the word partner. I will, she said clearly, her voice unwavering. Alistair took her left hand. His grip was firm, his large, calloused fingers the hands of a soldier, not a pampered lord enveloping hers. He slid a heavy band of platinum onto her finger. It was devoid of ostentatious diamonds. It was solid, practical, and enduring, a physical manifestation of their contract. With this ring I thee wed. Alistair murmured, his gaze never leaving her eyes. I pronounce that they be man and wife together. The vicar stepped back. The ritual was complete. There was a moment of hesitation. Tradition demanded a kiss to seal the union. Serafina braced herself, her body tensing slightly. Alistair saw the micro-expression of tension. He did not lean in to claim her lips. Instead, he raised her hand, the one now bearing his ring, and bowed his head, pressing his lips firmly to the back of her gloved knuckles. It was a gesture of profound, old-world chivalry, a public demonstration of the respect he had promised her in private. My Duchess, he said softly. Serafina released a breath she didn't know she had been holding. The tension melted from her shoulders. My lord, the journey to Ravenscroft Hall in Yorkshire took 3 days. The Duke's private carriage was a marvel of engineering, sprung flawlessly to absorb the ruts of the country roads lined with dark leather and polished walnut. Inside the carriage, the atmosphere was one of quiet, industrious peace. There was no awkward small talk. There were no forced attempts at intimacy. They sat on opposite benches, acting exactly like the partners they had agreed to be. Alistair spent the majority of the journey working through a stack of correspondence and legal documents, reading with a ferocious, concentrated speed. Serafina sat opposite him, reading a heavy volume on economic theory she had brought from her father's library. Occasionally, the carriage would hit a severe bump. Alistair would look up instantly, his military instincts flashing, his eyes checking her to ensure she was unhurt before returning to his papers. It was a subtle, unspoken vigilance that Serafina found unexpectedly comforting. He did not hover. He simply guarded. On the afternoon of the third day, the carriage turned off the main road and began the long ascent up a winding tree-lined drive. The ancient oaks formed a canopy overhead, their branches heavy with autumn leaves. "We are entering the estate," Alastair said, breaking a silence that had lasted for hours. He set his papers aside. Serafina leaned toward the window. The trees cleared, revealing a sprawling valley. In the center of the valley sat Ravenscroft Hall. It was not a house. It was a fortress of pale limestone, massive and imposing its architecture, a blend of severe classical lines and older, heavier masonry. It looked as unyielding and formidable as its master. It was flanked by vast rolling lawns, a dark glittering lake, and thousands of acres of dense woodland. "It is magnificent," Serafina breathed, genuinely awed by the scale of the power she had just married into. "It is a machine, Serafina," Alistair corrected quietly. "It requires constant management, constant vigilance. It supports 4 villages, 200 tenant farmers, and a massive supply chain for our northern mills. It is not a country retreat. It is the headquarters of an empire." He looked at her, his blue eyes sharp. "Are you ready to take command of your flank?" Serafina turned from the window, meeting his gaze with a fierce, intelligent light in her eyes. "Show me the ledgers." The carriage pulled into the vast gravel courtyard. A small army of servants stood at attention along the sweeping stone steps arranged with military precision. At the head of the staff stood the butler, a stiff, aging man named Mr. Carson, and the housekeeper, Mrs. Hughes, a woman with a severe expression and a ring of heavy iron keys at her waist. Alistair stepped out of the carriage first. He did not wait for the footman. He turned and offered his hand to Serafina. As she placed her hand in his, Alistair addressed his staff. His voice boomed across the courtyard, carrying the unquestionable weight of a general addressing his troops. "This is Her Grace, the Duchess of Ravenscroft," Alistair announced. "Her word carries the exact same weight as my own. Her authority is absolute. Any failure to respect her commands will be treated as a direct betrayal of this house. Is that understood?" "Yes, Your Grace," the staff echoed in unison, bowing deeply. Serafina stood tall beside him, feeling the immense weight of the mantle he had just placed upon her shoulders. He was not hiding her away. He was elevating her, placing her at the very pinnacle of his world. Alistair guided her up the steps and into the great hall. The interior was cavernous shadows clinging to the vaulted ceilings. Tapestries depicting ancient battles hung on the stone walls, and a massive fire roared in a hearth large enough to roast an ox. The air smelled of wood smoke, old paper, and beeswax. Mrs. Hughes stepped forward. "Welcome to Ravenscroft Hall, Your Grace. I have prepared the Duchess's suite in the East Wing. I will show you to your rooms so you may rest after the long journey." "Thank you, Mrs. Hughes," Serafina said, her voice steady and commanding. "But rest can wait. Before I see my chambers, I wish to see the archive room." Mrs. Hughes blinked, clearly taken aback. She glanced quickly at the Duke. Alistair's mouth twitched with the ghost of a proud smile. He looked at the housekeeper. "You heard the Duchess. Bring the lamps." The archive room was located in the oldest part of the house down a long, drafty corridor. Alistair unlocked the heavy oak door himself, pushing it open to reveal a massive, windowless chamber. The walls were lined floor to ceiling with wooden shelves groaning under the weight of hundreds of leather-bound ledgers, stacks of vellum contracts, maps, and correspondence files. The air was dry and smelled of dust and ink. In the center of the room sat a large scarred oak table with 2 heavy chairs. It was not a beautiful room, but to Serafina it was the most breathtaking sight in the world. It was a battlefield of numbers and laws, a place where intellect reigned supreme. Alistair walked to the center table and lit the oil lamp. The warm yellow light pushed back the shadows. He turned to face her. "This is the heart of it," Alistair said. "The estate records on the left. The shipping company manifests on the right. The investment portfolios are in the iron safe at the back. It is a labyrinth, Serafina. And somewhere in this labyrinth, I believe I am bleeding capital." Serafina stepped into the room, her eyes sweeping over the massive collection of data. She felt a profound sense of purpose ignite within her. She was no longer a helpless girl, waiting to be sold to cover a gambling debt. She was a strategist standing in the war room. "Where do you suspect the hemorrhage is occurring?" she asked, walking toward the shelf housing the estate records. "The northern tenant farms," Alistair replied, moving to stand beside the table. The yields have been dropping for 3 years. The estate manager claims it is poor soil and bad weather. I suspect it is mismanagement or worse, embezzlement. But I have not had the time to audit the granular details of the crop reports against the market sale prices. Serafina pulled down a heavy ledger from the shelf. She carried it to the table and opened it under the lamplight. She ran her finger down a column of numbers, her mind instantly shifting into analytical focus. I will need the market reports from the London Exchange for the past 36 months, she said, her voice crisp and professional. And I will need the original contracts you signed with the estate manager. Alistair watched her. He watched the way her eyes scanned the page, the intense concentration that smoothed out the defensive lines of her face. For the past 10 years, he has carried the crushing weight of his empire alone. He had trusted no one. He had surrounded himself with employees, but he had never had an equal. Watching her now diving into his financial records with a fierce, competent hunger, Alistair felt an unfamiliar sensation in his chest. The heavy, cold iron that had encased his heart since the war seemed to crack just a fraction. I will have them brought to you immediately, Alistair said softly. He stayed in the room with her for the next 3 hours. They did not speak of their marriage. They did not speak of the strange cold bargain that had brought them together. They spoke of crop rotations, fluctuating tariffs, and compound interest. They debated legal precedents regarding tenant rights. They were two brilliant, damaged minds circling each other, testing each other's intellect, and finding to their mutual astonishment an absolute match. When the grandfather clock in the distant hall chimed 8 o'clock, Alistair finally stepped back from the table. We should dine, he said. You must be exhausted. Serafina looked up from the ledger, blinking, as if pulling herself out of a trance. She realized her fingers were stained with ink, and her neck was stiff from bending over the table. But she felt more alive than she had in years. I am, she admitted. But this is fascinating, Alistair. The structure of your investments is incredibly aggressive. You have hedged against the American cotton market beautifully. A necessity of the current political climate, he replied. He offered his arm. Come, the ledgers will be here tomorrow. Dinner was a quiet affair served in a dining room that could have seated 40 people. They sat at opposite ends of the long table, separated by 20 feet of polished mahogany. Yet despite the physical distance, the intellectual connection forged in the archive room hung vibrantly in the air between them. After the meal, Alistair escorted her to the foot of the grand staircase. Mrs. Hughes will show you to your chambers, Alistair said. The formality had returned to his voice. The night had come, the time when the reality of their marriage could no longer be ignored by the distraction of ledgers. Serafina looked up at him. She remembered the promise he had made in her father's drawing room. I will not cross your threshold. Where are your rooms, Alistair? She asked quietly. The west wing, he replied, his jaw tight. On the opposite side of the house. He had physically placed as much distance between them as the architecture of the house allowed, ensuring she would feel completely secure, ensuring she would know he had no intention of ambushing her in the dark. I see, Serafina said. She felt a sudden strange pang in her chest. It wasn't disappointment exactly, but a profound realization of his deep, self-imposed isolation. He was giving her safety, but in doing so, he was returning to his own lonely fortress. Good night, Serafina, he said, taking a step back. Good night, Alistair, she replied. She followed Mrs. Hughes up the stairs and through the winding corridors to the east wing. Her chambers were magnificent, decorated in rich tones of gold and cream, dominated by a massive four-poster bed. A fire was crackling cheerfully in the hearth. A maid had already laid out her nightgown. Will you be requiring anything else, Your Grace? Mrs. Hughes asked. No, thank you. You may go, Serafina said. When the heavy door clicked shut, Serafina was finally alone. She stood in the center of the vast, luxurious room. She was the Duchess of Ravenscroft. She was safe from Malachi Vance. Her father could no longer sell her. Her brother's future was secure. She walked over to the dressing table and unpinned her hair, letting it fall in a heavy dark cascade over her shoulders. She looked at her reflection in the mirror. She looked at the heavy platinum ring on her left hand. She thought of the men in White's Club men who viewed women as property, as burdens, as decorative fools. And then she thought of Alistair Montgomery, a man who possessed the power to crush a city, yet who had stepped back and handed her the key to his empire. A man who had looked at her not with lust or pity, but with profound intellectual respect. He was a man traumatized by war, hardened by betrayal, living in a self-imposed winter. He had bought her to save her, and he had made her his partner because he recognized her strength. Serafina walked over to the large window and pulled back the heavy velvet curtain. She looked out into the darkness of the Yorkshire night. Across the vast courtyard in the distant west wing of the massive house, a single solitary light burned in a window. Alistair was awake. He was alone in his fortress standing guard. Serafina pressed her hand against the cold glass. The bargain was sealed. The contract was signed. But as she watched that solitary light burning in the dark, she realized that this marriage of convenience was rapidly becoming something entirely unexpected. It was not a cage. It was a foundation. And upon this foundation of intellect, respect, and duty, Serafina vowed to build an empire alongside the Iron Duke. She let the curtain fall, walked to the bed, and for the first time in months, she slept deeply wrapped in the absolute unbreakable safety provided by her partner. The rhythm of Ravenscroft Hall was not dictated by the rising sun or the chiming of parlor clocks, but by the relentless grinding machinery of industry and estate management. For the first month of their marriage, the Duke and Duchess did not exist as newlyweds. They existed as generals mapping a campaign. Autumn deepened, turning the Yorkshire valleys into a tapestry of copper and bruised purple. Inside the archive room, the air remained dry, heavy with the scent of aged leather and iron gall ink. This windowless chamber had become Serafina's domain. She arrived at 7 each morning, a cup of black tea at her elbow, her hair pinned back in absolute severity. She did not wear the emerald silks of her wedding day. She wore practical wool, dark and unyielding, the uniform of a woman preparing for a siege. Alistair watched her. He observed her from the doorway before she knew he was there. He watched the way her eyes tracked across columns of complex financial data, the way her brow furrowed in concentration, the way her ink-stained fingers traced the convoluted lineages of property law. He had spent his entire life surrounded by men who claimed to understand the world of a finance, men who puffed cigars and blustered about market shares. Not one of them possessed the terrifying surgical precision of the woman sitting at his table. She was dismantling his empire piece by piece and rebuilding it stronger. On the 32nd day of her tenure in the archives, the silence of the room was broken by the sharp, definitive snap of a ledger closing. Alistair looked up from his own correspondence at the far end of the oak table. The firelight cast long, dancing shadows across the scarred wood. Serafina did not look triumphant. She looked deadly. She slid a thick vellum document across the polished surface of the table. It came to rest inches from Alistair's hand. "The Northern Mill Tracts," Serafina said. Her voice was perfectly level, devoid of panic but laced with a cold metallic urgency. "Specifically the land leasing agreements drafted 4 years ago, brokered by the London Syndicate." Alistair frowned, his military instincts instantly flaring at her tone. He picked up the vellum. "These are standard agricultural and industrial leases. I reviewed them myself before signing." "You reviewed the primary clauses, Alistair," she corrected, stepping around the table to stand beside his chair. She pointed a slender, ink-smudged finger at a dense block of text buried deep in the third appendix. "Read the subordination clause regarding infrastructural maintenance, specifically paragraph 7, subsection 4. Alistair's icy blue eyes scanned the archaic legal phrasing. The language was convoluted, intentionally dense, a labyrinth of subclauses and conditional precedents. He read it once, then he read it again. The blood slowly drained from his face, replaced by a dark, simmering fury. "An escalating default trigger," Alistair murmured, his voice dropping to a dangerous, gravelly rumble. "Precisely," Serafina confirmed, leaning over him, her shoulder brushing his, entirely focused on the document. "If the Ravenscroft estate fails to maintain the aqueducts feeding the lower valley mills to a highly subjective standard of optimal flow, the syndicate has the right to declare a breach of contract. But it does not just void the lease. The penalty clause dictates that the water rights in the thousands of acres of arable land relying upon them revert to the syndicate's holding company at a fraction of their market value." Alistair sat back, the heavy vellum crinkling in his massive hands. "It is a time bomb, a legal landmine planted directly beneath the foundation of my northern revenues." "And it is armed," Serafina said quietly. "I cross-referenced the syndicate's holding company. It is a shell corporation. The primary shareholder, heavily obfuscated through 3 layers of continental banking, is Lord Malachi Vance. The name hung in the air, a venomous echo from the gambling hells of London. Vance had not just been trying to ruin her father. He had been playing a long, agonizing game of financial chess against the Iron Duke, waiting for a drought or a collapsed aqueduct to steal the jewel of Maui Gel of the Montgomery Empire. Alistair looked up at Serafina. He did not see a woman he had purchased. He saw the savior of his legacy. He saw a mind that had just parried a fatal blow aimed at his throat. The sheer staggering competence of her action struck him harder than any physical blow ever could. He engineered the gambling debts, Alistair said, the realization settling over him like winter ice. He bankrupted your father to draw me out. He knew I would not let the Hawley estate fall. He wanted me distracted in London fighting over scraps while this trigger quietly matured in the north. He underestimated you, Serafina replied, her stormy eyes locked on his. And he did not account for me. Alistair slowly pushed his chair back and stood up. He towered over her in the dim light of the archive room. The space between them was charged with an electric, pulsing respect. No, Alistair said softly, his gaze mapping the determined lines of her face. He did not. The lawyers I pay thousands of pounds a year miss this. My estate managers miss this. But you found Miriam in the dark. He reached out. It was the first time he had willingly initiated physical contact since he had kissed her glove at the altar. He did not embrace her. He simply placed his large calloused hand on her shoulder. The grip was firm, grounding a soldier, acknowledging his most trusted lieutenant. You have secured our flank, Serafina, he said, the weight of the pronoun hanging heavy between them. Our flank. How do we dismantle it? She asked, not leaning away from his touch, drawing strength from it. We do not dismantle it, Alistair said, a predatory coldness returning to his eyes. We weaponize it. We reconstruct the aqueducts. We over-engineer them to a standard so high that Vance's inspectors will choke on the documentation. And then we quietly buy the debt of Yashel Corporation. When he reaches for the trigger, he will find the gun is pointed at his own head. They spent the rest of the night in the Grand Library, the fire burning down to embers. They did not retreat to their separate wings. The boundaries of their arranged marriage were dissolving, washed away by the sheer thrill of shared intellectual warfare. Alistair poured 2 glasses of aged brandy. He handed one to Serafina. She took it without hesitation, savoring the burn of the amber liquid. You possess a ruthlessness I did not anticipate, Serafina, Alistair mused, sitting in the leather wingback chair opposite hers. Where did you learn to dissect a man's ruins so clinically? From observing the men who ruined my father, she answered, holding the crystal glass in both hands. I learned early that society is not governed by morality, Alistair. It is governed by leverage. If you do not understand the mechanics of power, you become its victim. A very Hobbesian view of the world, he noted, a faint smile touching his scarred mouth. I prefer Mill wine, she countered smoothly. John Stuart Mill. The concept that liberty is the absence of coercion. I could not fight Vance with a sword, so I learned to fight him with the very laws he uses to bind others. True liberty, I believe, requires absolute competence. Alistair stared at her over the rim of his glass. In the elite clubs of London, men debated these philosophers as abstract parlor games. But this woman sitting across from him, swathed in dark wool and firelight, lived it. She had forged her intellect into a shield to survive a world that demanded her submission. When I proposed this marriage, Alistair began, his voice dropping, the ambient sounds of the manor fading away. I told you I needed a partner, but I did not tell you the entirety of the truth. Serafina went very still. What did you conceal? My board of directors. Alistair confessed, the words heavy with years of solitary burden. The men who hold minority stakes in the shipping lines and the rail networks. I have suspected for over a year that they are colluding to force a vote of no confidence. They believe my military background makes me too rigid, too unyielding for modern commerce. They want to fracture the empire and sell the pieces. I could not trust my own solicitors. I could not trust my managers. I was surrounded by men smiling to my face while sharpening knives in the shadows. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, his massive frame looking suddenly weary. I needed an insider, someone who could audit the entire structure with absolute, unquestionable legal authority. A wife is legally an extension of the Duke himself. Her access cannot be denied by a board of directors, but a traditional wife would have been useless to me. I needed a legal titan. I needed a mind that could outmaneuver the most corrupt barristers in London. He looked into her eyes, stripping away the final layer of his imposing facade. I did not just rescue you from a gambling table, Serafina. I drafted you into a war. I needed you to save my life's work. Serafina absorbed the magnitude of his confession. He was not the invincible Iron Duke. He was a man standing alone on a crumbling wall holding back the tide. And he had looked at her, a discarded daughter, and seen his only hope of salvation. Then it is a good thing, Serafina said, her voice dropping to a fierce, intimate whisper, that I am not a traditional wife. We will purge your board, Alistair. We will break them. The alliance was sealed not with a kiss, but with absolute unflinching loyalty. Nature, however, cares nothing for the carefully laid plans of dukes and lawyers. 3 days later, the sky over Yorkshire bruised into a violent, sickening shade of green. The air pressure dropped so rapidly it made the ears pop. Then the heavens tore open. It was not a rainstorm, it was a deluge. For 48 hours, the rain lashed against the mullioned windows of Ravenscroft Hall like grape shot. The wind howled through the ancient chimneys, a mournful, terrifying sound that rattled the heavy oak doors. On the evening of the second day, Alistair burst into the library. He was entirely stripped of his aristocratic trappings. He wore heavy leather riding boots, thick canvas trousers, and a waxed coat dripping with water. His hair was plastered to his skull, his face pale and grim. "The River Ouse has breached its banks," he said, his voice cutting through the roar of the storm outside. "The lower valley is flooding. The tenant farms at the river bend are going under." Serafina was on her feet instantly. "The family's trapped," Alistair said, already turning back toward the door. "The estate manager is trying to rally a rescue party, but the men are panicking in the dark. I am riding down. I am coming with you." Alistair stopped dead. He turned back, his eyes flashing with raw fear for her safety. "Absolutely not. The currents are fast enough to sweep a draft horse away. You will remain here." "I am the Duchess of Ravenscroft," Serafina fired back, her voice ringing with absolute, unshakable authority. She closed the distance between them. "Those are my people as much as they are yours. You cannot manage a panic alone in the dark, Alistair. You need a second command point to direct the wagons while you pull them from the water. I am coming." He looked at her. He saw the iron in her spine. There was no time to argue. There was only the brutal calculus of survival. "Get a heavy coat," he barked. 5 minutes. The night was a screaming nightmare of water and wind. Serafina rode beside Alistair, the driving rain blinding her, the cold biting into her bones. Her horse slipped in the churning mud, but she held the reins with a death grip, urging the beast forward. When they reached the lower valley, the sight was apocalyptic. The river had transformed into a raging black ocean. Small cottages were half submerged, the muddy water swirling violently around their thatched roofs. Men, women, and children were clustered on the high ground, screaming over the roar of the flood. Alistair did not hesitate. He spurred his massive black stallion directly into the freezing water. He was shouting orders, his voice carrying the terrifying resonance of a battlefield commander. He was pulling children from the roofs, hauling men into the waiting rowboats, a tireless engine of sheer willpower. Serafina did not ride into the deep water. She knew her physical limitations. Instead, she became the anchor on the shoreline line. She dismounted into the knee-deep mud, rallying the terrified estate workers. "Bring the wagons forward," she screamed, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Blankets. We need the dry blankets on the elevated ridge. Do not panic. Form a line." She waded into the freezing muck, grabbing the halters of panicked draft horses, forcing them into position. She hauled freezing children from the rowboats as Alistair brought them in, wrapping them in wool, directing the families to the safety of the upper estate. For 6 grueling, agonizing hours, they fought the river. Serafina lost her hat. Her hair was plastered to her face, heavy with freezing mud. Her hands were bruised and bleeding from hauling heavy ropes. But she did not stop. Every time she looked out into the churning, black water, she saw Alistair. He was a shadow of strength, refusing to yield a single life to the flood. And every time Alistair looked back to the shore, he saw his wife. She was a beacon of absolute control in the center of the panic, holding the line, securing their people. By dawn, the rain finally broke. The river began to recede, leaving behind a devastated landscape of mud and debris. But the upper ridge was crowded with shivering, exhausted families. Not a single life had been lost. Alistair waded out of the shallows leading his exhausted horse. He was covered in black river mud from head to toe. He looked like a demon forged from the earth itself. He walked heavily toward the wagons. Serafina was leaning against the wheel of a cart, her chest heaving, her hands shaking from the cold and the adrenaline. She was filthy, soaked to the bone, her elegant features obscured by dirt. Alistair stopped in front of her. The storm had washed away every title, every pretense, every barrier of polite society. There was only the raw, stripped-down truth of what they had just survived. He looked at her bleeding hands. He looked at the fierce, unyielding light in her eyes. Without a word, Alistair reached out and pulled her into his chest. It was not a romantic embrace. It was a collision of survivors. He wrapped his massive, mud-caked arms around her, crushing her to him. Serafina buried her face in the wet canvas of his coat, wrapping her arms tightly around his waist. She felt the heavy thudding beat of his heart. She smelled the river water and the sweat of his labor. They stood there in the freezing mud, clinging to each other in front of the ruined valley. In that silent, desperate embrace, the final walls between them shattered. They had bled together. They had fought the dark together. The partnership of the mind had fused irrevocably into a partnership of the soul. They returned to the hall in silence. The staff descended upon them, drawing hot baths, rushing with dry towels and brandy. Serafina sat in her chambers, wrapped in a thick robe before a roaring fire, her muscles screaming in protest. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a profound, aching exhaustion. But she did not feel weak. She felt invincible. The heavy door connecting their chambers, a door that had remained locked since the day she arrived, suddenly clicked. Serafina turned. Alistair stood in the doorway. He had bathed wearing dark trousers and a loose white shirt, his hair still damp. He looked at her across the expanse of the luxurious room. He held a glass of brandy in his hand. He didn't speak. He walked across the room, poured a second glass from the decanter on her table and handed it to her. Then he sank heavily into the armchair opposite hers. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the flames. It was the comfortable, deep silence of veterans who needed no words to explain the war they had just fought. "You were magnificent," Alistair said finally, his voice a low, raspy whisper. "We held the line," Serafina replied softly. Alistair closed his eyes, resting his head back against the chair. I have never had anyone guard my back before. Not since the Crimea. Even then you die alone in the mud. Today, I looked at the shore and you were there." "I will always be there, Alistair," she said. The promise was absolute. He opened his eyes and looked at her. The icy reserve was entirely gone. In its place was an emotion so raw, so potent, it made Serafina's breath catch. He looked at her with a reverence usually reserved for the divine. "Sleep, Serafina," he murmured, his voice softening into a protective cadence. "The war is won for today." He stood, placed his empty glass on the table and retreated back to his chambers. But this time he did not lock the connecting door. The peace, however, was a fragile thing. 2 nights later, the darkness in Alistair's mind broke loose. Serafina was asleep, buried under heavy quilts when she heard it. It was a sound that froze the blood in her veins, a low, guttural shout of sheer terror, followed by the crash of breaking glass. It came from the West Wing. It came from Alistair. She did not hesitate. She did not grab her robe. In her white linen nightgown, barefoot, Serafina sprinted across her room and threw open the connecting door. Alistair's chamber was in shadows, lit only by the dying embers of the fire. The heavy bedside table had been overturned. The water pitcher lay shattered on the floor. Alistair was backed into the far corner of the room. He was trapped in a nightmare that had breached the waking world. He was clutching his head, his chest heaving with ragged, panicked breaths. His eyes were wide open, but they were not seeing the luxurious bedroom. They were seeing the valley of death. They were seeing the light brigade torn to shreds by Russian artillery. "Hold the flank!" he screamed, his voice cracking with agony. "They have the high ground, incoming, get down." He was a titan reduced to a terrified soldier. The PTSD, the invisible shrapnel he had carried for a decade, was tearing him apart from the inside. A traditional woman would have screamed. A traditional woman would have run for the servants, terrified of the violent, unpredictable man in the dark. Serafina Hawley was not a traditional woman. She walked slowly, deliberately across the room. She did not flinch when she stepped on a shard of broken porcelain, ignoring the sting in her heel. "Alistair," she said. Her voice was calm, firm, and incredibly grounding. She used the tone one uses to walk a man back from the edge of a cliff. He didn't hear her. He threw his arms up violently, bracing for an impact that wasn't there. "The guns! Silence the guns!" Serafina stepped directly into his line of sight. She did not try to restrain him. He was twice her size and could have crushed her in his panic. Instead, she stood directly in front of him, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his trembling body. "Alistair Montgomery," she said, her voice commanding, cutting through the phantom artillery fire. "Look at me." He gasped, his wild, unseeing eyes locking onto the white figure before him. "You are not in the valley," Seraphine said, her voice dropping to a steady rhythmic cadence. "You are in Yorkshire. You are at Ravenscroft Hall. The war is over. The guns are silent. You survived." He stared at her, his breathing rapid, his mind warring between the hallucination and reality. "Blood? There is so much blood! There is no blood here." "Oh," she countered, her voice an anchor in the storm. She slowly raised her hands and placed them flat against his broad, heaving chest. "Feel my hands, Alistair. Feel the cold. The Crimea is 1,000 miles away. You are home. You are with me." She did not coddle him. She did not pity him. She provided absolute empirical proof of his safety. She was employing the Stoic philosophy they had debated, grounding the mind in the undeniable reality of the present moment. Alistair stared down at her. The scent of her clean linen and rain began to overpower the phantom smell of sulfur and death. He felt the small, firm pressure of her hands against his chest. Slowly, agonizingly, the terrifying haze of the nightmare began to recede. The library, the broken glass, the dying fire, the real world snapped back into focus. He realized he was backed into a corner, trembling like a frightened child. He, the Iron Duke, the man who terrified the financial markets of London, had broken down completely in front of his wife. The shame hit him like a physical blow. He closed his eyes, his massive shoulders slumping in absolute defeat. "Leave me," he whispered, a harsh, broken sound. "Please, Serafina. Leave me. I am a monster." "You are a man who carried the weight of hell, so others would not have to," Serafina replied instantly. Her voice brooked no argument. She did not leave. Instead, she stepped closer. She slid her arms around his waist and rested her head against his chest. She held him. She provided a physical barrier between him and the ghosts of his past. Alistair stood frozen for a second. Then a ragged sob tore from his throat. The dam broke. 10 years of suppressed terror, of agonizing grief for the men he had watched die, of the crushing loneliness of his survival poured out of him. The most powerful man in England sank to his knees on the floor of his bedroom, pulling his wife down with him. He buried his face in her neck, his massive frame shaking with silent, agonizing tears. Serafina held him. She sat on the cold floor, surrounded by broken glass, and cradled the head of the Iron Duke. She stroked his damp hair, her hands steady and endlessly soothing. She murmured words of comfort, quiet affirmations of his safety, of his worth, of his honor. She became his sanctuary. She became the only safe space in a world that had demanded he be invincible. In her arms, he was allowed to be broken. In her arms, he was allowed to heal. They stayed on the floor for hours until the trembling stopped, until his breathing slowed into the deep, rhythmic cadence of exhaustion. He had fallen asleep with his head resting on her lap, his hand gripping the fabric of her nightgown, as if she were a lifeline. Serafina looked down at the harsh, scarred face of her husband. The fierce intellectual respect she held for him had evolved. As she watched him sleep, stripped of all his armor, she realized with quiet, terrifying certainty that she had fallen entirely, irrevocably in love with him. It was not a foolish romantic infatuation. It was a love forged in the fires of mutual survival. It was a love built on the absolute certainty that they were intellectual equals, that they were partners in every sense of the word. When dawn finally broke, casting pale gray light into the room, Alistair stirred. He opened his eyes, disoriented for a moment before the memory of the night crashed over him. He sat up slowly, looking at Serafina. She looked exhausted, pale, her nightgown wrinkled. "You stayed," he said, his voice raw. "I am your ally, Alistair," she said simply. Allies do not abandon the field when the battle turns ugly. Alistair looked at her, his blue eyes profound and incredibly clear. The heavy, dark shadow that had haunted him for a decade seemed lighter. The iron casing around his heart had been shattered not by force, but by the relentless, quiet strength of her compassion. He reached out and gently brushed a lock of hair from her face. His knuckles grazed her cheek. It was a touch of devastating tenderness. "You are my salvation, Serafina," he whispered. He stood up and offered her his hand, pulling her to her feet. They did not kiss. The moment was too heavy, too profound for a simple physical declaration. They understood in the silent language of their partnership that a fundamental shift had occurred. Later that morning, while Alistair was meeting with the estate manager to review the flood damage, Serafina remained in his chambers to tidy the mess of the night before. As she was righting the overturned bedside table, a small leather-bound notebook fell from the drawer and landed softly on the rug. It was old, the leather scuffed and worn. Serafina picked it up. She did not intend to pry, but the book fell open in her hands. The pages were filled with Alistair's sharp, aggressive handwriting. But they were not financial ledgers. They were not military strategies. They were tears, transcriptions. Serafina frowned, her eyes scanning the text. The true measure of a society's failure is the normalization of its cruelty toward the vulnerable. We disguise tyranny as tradition and cowardice as compliance. Serafina's breath caught in her throat. She recognized those words. She had written them. 3 years ago, she had published a series of anonymous academic essays in a radical London journal dissecting the hypocrisy of marital law and aristocratic privilege. She had written them in the dead of night, hiding her intellect from her father and a society that would have shunned her for possessing a mind. She turned the pages, her heart hammering against her ribs. Page after page was filled with her own thoughts, her own philosophical arguments meticulously copied out in Alistair's hand. In the margins, he had written his own notes. He had debated her anonymous persona. He had analyzed her logic. A brilliant mind, he had written next to one of her essays on property rights. A mind that sees the mechanics beneath the illusion. Who is this writer? They understand the architecture of power better than the Prime Minister. Serafina stared at the journal, the reality of the situation rewriting the entire history of their marriage. Alistair had not just been a wealthy duke passing a gambling table. He had not just intervened on a whim. He had known. Somehow he had discovered that the brilliant anonymous philosopher he had been studying for 3 years was the quiet, overlooked daughter of Lord Hawley. He had been watching her. He had been waiting. The night at White's Club had not been a random rescue. It had been a targeted extraction. He had not bought a desperate girl to save her from ruin. He had unleashed his entire financial empire to secure White Dipper, the one mine in England he believed was equal to his own. He had chosen her long before she ever knew he existed. Serafina closed the journal, her hands trembling. A single tear escaped her eye, tracing a warm path down her cheek. It was a tear of absolute, overwhelming joy. She was not a debt. She was not a transaction. She was his chosen equal. She clutched the journal to her chest, looking toward the window, toward the vast lands of Ravenscroft. The storm had passed. The sky was clear. And for the first time in her life, Serafina Hawley knew exactly who she was and exactly where she belonged. She was the Duchess of Ravenscroft, the partner of the Iron Duke. And it was time to return to London and annihilate the men who had dared to think she was nothing more than a pawn on a felt table. London in the height of the season was a gilded cage of whispered scandals and velvet-draped cruelty. To the untrained eye, the grand ballroom of the Duke of Devonshire's Mayfair residence was a triumph of civilization. Thousands of beeswax candles burned in massive crystal chandeliers, casting a warm golden light over a sea of rustling silks, glittering diamonds, and tailored evening coats. Orchestral music drifted from the gallery, a polite waltz that masked the ruthless social maneuvering happening on the floor below. But Serafina Montgomery, the Duchess of Ravenscroft, no longer saw the illusion. She saw the mechanics. She stood at the top of the grand marble staircase, her hand resting lightly on the dark sleeve of her husband's coat. She did not wear the pastel colors of the debutantes, nor the ostentatious jewels of the established matrons. She wore a gown of midnight blue velvet, devoid of lace, cut with an architectural precision that mirrored the armor of a warrior. Around her neck lay a single flawless sapphire, the Ravenscroft crest. Beside her, Alistair stood like a monument of dark iron. He wore stark black, his silver-streaked hair catching the candlelight, His scarred face set in an expression of terrifying, unreadable calm. They did not look like a couple seeking the approval of society. They looked like an invading army that had just crested the hill. "Are you prepared, my Duchess?" Alistair asked, his voice a low, resonant rumble that only she could hear over the swell of the music. Serafina looked down at the swirling crowd. She saw the precise moment their arrival was noted. Heads turned, fans fluttered to conceal whispering mouths. The music seemed to thin out as the collective attention of England's most powerful elite zeroed in on the woman who had allegedly been bought to cover a gambling debt. "I am your ally, Alistair," she replied smoothly, her stormy eyes completely devoid of fear. "And we are here to close the ledger." He offered a fraction of a smile, a dangerous predatory curve of his lips. "Then let us descend." They moved down the staircase in perfect synchronization. The crowd parted for them, a physical manifestation of the power they wielded. The whispers followed them like the hiss of a breaking wave. "There she is, the Hawley girl." He paid £20,000 for her, a tragic waste of capital. Serafina ignored them. She did not seek out her former acquaintances. She did not shrink into the shadows. She walked directly into the center of the ballroom, Alistair at her side, claiming the space with the absolute authority of a woman who had saved an empire from flooding and audited the most complex financial network in Britain. It did not take long for the predator to circle. Lord Malachi Vance emerged from a cluster of conservative politicians. He wore a coat of deep plum, a forced smile plastered across his aristocratic face. But behind the smile, his eyes were darting, nervous, entirely lacking the arrogant certainty he had possessed at White's Club months ago. He approached them bowing with exaggerated mocking politeness. "Your Grace and the lovely Duchess, how delightful to see you return to civilization. We had feared the harsh Yorkshire winters had entirely consumed you." Alistair did not bow. He did not extend his hand. He merely looked at Vance with the cold, detached interest of a scientist observing a dying insect. "Yorkshire was highly productive, Vance," Alistair said softly. "The air is cleaner. The vermin are fewer." Vance's smile tightened, his jaw clenching. He turned his attention to Serafina, seeking the weaker target. He still believed she was the terrified girl standing behind her father's chair. "And you, my dear," Vance purred, raising his voice just enough to ensure the surrounding aristocrats could hear the insult. "You look remarkably well for a woman whose entire future was decided on the roll of a dice. Tell me, does the Duke require you to balance his household accounts to earn your keep? Or has he found other uses for his investment?" A collective gasp rippled through the immediate circle of eavesdroppers. It was a vile, unforgivable breach of etiquette, a direct challenge to the Iron Duke's honor. Alistair's massive frame tensed. The air around him seemed to drop by 10 degrees. He shifted his weight, preparing to dismantle Vance where he stood. But before Alistair could speak, Serafina placed her gloved hand flat against his chest. It was a subtle gesture, but Alistair stopped instantly. He looked down at her. She gave him a microscopic nod. "This is my battlefield." Alistair stepped back, yielding the floor to his partner. Serafina took a single step toward Lord Vance. She did not raise her voice. She did not flush with anger. She looked at him with a chilling, analytical serenity. "I do balance the accounts, Lord Vance," Serafina said, her voice carrying the crisp, undeniable weight of absolute competence. "In fact, I recently audited the ledgers of the Northern Mills Syndicate, a fascinating exercise in corporate obfuscation." Vance's face drained of color. The plum coat suddenly looked too large for his shrinking frame. I, I do not discuss business at a social function, Your Grace," Vance stammered, taking a half step back. "But we must," Serafina pressed her tone, relentless, dissecting him with the precision of a scalpel. "Because I found the subordination clauses you buried in the aqueduct leases. The ones designed to force a default and strip the Ravenscroft estate of its water rights." The surrounding aristocrats, men who held seats in Parliament and controlled banks, suddenly went dead silent. This was not a domestic squabble. This was high-level corporate warfare being exposed in the center of a ballroom. "You are speaking nonsense," Vance hissed, a bead of sweat breaking out on his forehead. "You are a woman. You do not understand the complexities of—" "I understand that a shell corporation registered in Geneva requires an unbroken chain of liquidity to maintain its leverage." Serafina cut him off, her voice ringing with intellectual supremacy. I understand that you used the syndicate's capital to short the American cotton market, assuming the blockade would hold. And I understand that when the blockade broke 3 weeks ago, your margin calls exceeded your total liquid assets by 400%. Vance was hyperventilating now. The polite mask had shattered, revealing the desperate ruined man underneath. You engineered my father's gambling debts. Serafina continued, her voice dropping to a low, lethal register. You extended him endless credit, knowing his weaknesses specifically to acquire me as a bargaining chip against the Duke. You used a man's addiction to try and steal an empire because you lacked the intellect to build one yourself. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. The music had stopped. The elite of London were witnessing an execution. It is a lie, Vance shouted, his voice cracking with panic. It is slander. I will sue you for every penny you possess. She possesses the entire Montgomery fortune, Vance. Alistair finally spoke. He stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with his wife. He was no longer the silent observer. He was the gavel coming down. Alistair reached into his coat and produced a thick stack of heavy watermarked bank drafts. He held them up in the candlelight. These are your promissory notes, Malachi. Alistair said, his voice echoing in the cavernous room. Every margin call, every debt you owe to the Geneva Syndicate, every mortgage on your London properties. When my Duchess discovered your trap in the northern leases, we did not just repair the aqueducts. We used the Ravenscroft capital reserves to buy your debt. Vance stared at the papers, his eyes wide with absolute unadulterated horror. You do not owe the banks any more, Vance, Alistair said softly. You owe my wife, and she is calling in the debt. All of it, effective at the opening of the exchange tomorrow morning. Vance's knees buckled. He collapsed onto the polished marble floor, his hands clutching his chest. He was a man who had delighted in the ruin of others, finally crushed under the weight of his own profound inadequacy. Alistair looked down at the broken man, feeling no pity, only the cold satisfaction of absolute justice. You thought she was a pawn, Vance. Alistair said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. You thought she was property. You failed to realize she is the architect of your destruction. Alistair turned his back on the ruined lord. He offered his arm to Serafina. She took it, her posture immaculate, her expression entirely calm. They walked out of the ballroom together. No one spoke. No one moved to stop them. The Iron Duke and his brilliant Duchess had just rearranged the hierarchy of London society without throwing a single punch. They had fought with intellect, with law, and with absolute unbreakable solidarity. The night air outside the Devonshire house was crisp and sharp. The footman opened the door to the Ravenscroft carriage. Alistair handed Serafina inside before climbing in and pulling the heavy door shut. As the carriage lurched forward, leaving the lights of Mayfair behind, the adrenaline that had sustained Serafina finally began to ebb. The sheer magnitude of what they had just accomplished washed over her. She closed her eyes, letting out a long, trembling breath, resting her head against the dark leather squabs. Alistair did not light the carriage lamp. They sat in the shadows, illuminated only by the passing gas lights of the London streets. It is done, Alistair said quietly. His voice was different now. The cold metallic edge of the Duke was gone. He sounded profoundly tired but deeply at peace. He will flee to the continent by morning. He is finished. Justice is a remarkably efficient mechanism when properly applied, Serafina murmured, opening her eyes to look at him. Alistair was already watching her. In the shifting shadows, his scarred face was arresting. The walls he had maintained for a decade were completely dismantled. He looked at her not as a commander assessing a lieutenant, but as a man looking at the very center of his universe. He reached across the space between them. He took her gloved hand in his calloused fingers slowly working the silk buttons at her wrist. He peeled the glove away, exposing her bare skin to the cool air, and then wove his fingers through hers. His grip was warm, solid, anchoring her to the earth. I saw the journal, Alistair, Serafina said softly. Alistair's breath caught. His hand tightened around hers. He did not look away. He did not deny it. I found it in your chambers after the storm. She continued, her voice trembling just slightly with the weight of the emotion she had carried since that morning. The transcriptions, the essays, you knew who I was before you walked into White's Club. Alistair lowered his head, a heavy, ragged sigh escaping his chest. I have read your mind for 3 years, Serafina. I read your arguments on coercion, on liberty, on the mechanics of power. You articulated the exact philosophy that I had forged in the mud of the Crimea. You understood the world the way I did. I spent years trying to unmask the anonymous genius in that journal. When my solicitors finally traced the publication payments to a proxy account linked to your family, I realized the greatest mind in England was trapped in a house with a gambling addict. He lifted his head, his piercing blue eyes locking onto hers with a devastating, naked honesty. When Vance made his move, I didn't intervene to save a damsel in distress. I deployed my capital to secure my equal. I didn't buy a debt, Serafina. I paid the price of admission to stand beside you. The absolute reverence in his voice brought a sudden sharp sting of tears to Serafina's eyes. She had spent her life feeling invisible, a ghost haunting her father's library. And this man, this titan of industry, had seen her entirely. You gave me a choice, Alistair, she whispered. You gave me the keys to your empire and asked nothing in return. Because a partnership coerced is a cage, he replied fiercely. I wanted your intellect. I wanted your alliance. But I swore I would never demand your heart unless you chose to give it. Serafina moved across the carriage. She did not hesitate. She slid across the leather bench, closing the distance between them, and pressed her hands flat against his chest. She felt the heavy, rapid thud of his heart beneath the fine wool of his coat. Then let me be clear, Alistair Montgomery. She said, her voice a fierce, unbroken vow. I choose you. I choose the man who held my hand in the flood. I choose the man who gave me a library instead of a cage. I choose my partner. Alistair let out a sound that was half groan, half prayer. He wrapped his massive arms around her, pulling her onto his lap, burying his face in the curve of her neck. He breathed her in the scent of lavender and rain the scent of his salvation. When he finally kissed her, it was not the polite, restrained brush of lips from their wedding day. It was a collision of souls. It was hungry, desperate, and profoundly deep. It was the kiss of a man who had wandered in the freezing dark for 10 years, finally stepping into the sunlight. Serafina responded with equal ferocity, her hands tangling in his silver-streaked hair, pulling him closer, anchoring him to her. They did not speak for the rest of the journey. They did not need to. The contract had been rewritten in the language of absolute, undeniable love. When they arrived at the Ravenscroft townhouse in Mayfair, Alistair did not let the footman assist her. He lifted Serafina into his arms, carrying her effortlessly up the grand staircase. He did not turn toward the separate wings of the house. He carried her directly into his own chambers, kicking the heavy oak door shut behind them. That night there were no barriers. There were no ghosts of the Crimea, no shadows of gambling hells. There was only the profound healing intimacy of two brilliant minds, finally allowing their bodies to bridge the remaining distance. Alistair loved her with a slow, devastating tenderness, treating her not as a conquest, but as an object of supreme reverence. He worshipped the mind that had saved his empire, and he worshipped the woman who had chosen to stay in his arms. The next morning, London was awash in the scandalous news of Lord Vance's absolute financial collapse. But inside the quiet sanctuary of the Duke's bedchamber, the world outside ceased to matter. Serafina woke to the feeling of heavy, warm sunlight streaming through the tall windows. She was tangled in the linen sheets, her head resting on Alistair's chest. He was already awake, his arm wrapped securely around her waist, his fingers gently tracing the line of her spine. Good morning, my Duchess, he murmured, his voice thick with sleep and absolute contentment. Serafina smiled, shifting closer to his warmth. Good morning, Alistair. He kissed the top of her head. Then he reached over to the bedside table. He picked up a thick, sealed envelope and placed it gently on the pillow beside her. Serafina frowned, pushing herself up on one elbow, the sheet falling away from her shoulders. What is this? Open it, he said quietly. She broke the wax seal. Inside was a heavy sheaf of legal vellum drafted in the unmistakable, precise handwriting of Alistair's chief solicitor. She scanned the first page, her legal mind instantly processing the archaic terminology. It was an irrevocable deed of trust. Well, Alistair, she breathed, her eyes flying over the paragraphs. This is a transfer of assets, an independent portfolio. The Northern Railway shares the London properties, the shipping dividends. It is a trust in your name alone, Serafina, Alistair explained, sitting up beside her. It requires no marital authorization to access. It cannot be contested by my heirs, my board, or any court in England. It guarantees your absolute financial independence in perpetuity. Serafina stared at the document. It was a fortune. It was enough money to make her one of the wealthiest independent women in the world. "When did you draft this?" "3 days before our wedding," Alistair said softly. The revelation hit her with staggering force. He had drafted this before she had ever proven her competence in the archives. He had drafted it while she was still a stranger he had rescued from a gambling hall. "Why?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Because of Miltoil." Alistair smiled, a true, genuine smile that transformed his scarred face into something heartbreakingly handsome. "Liberty is the absence of coercion. I knew that you were marrying me because you had no other choice. I knew you were acting to save your family, but I could not build a partnership on the foundation of a trap." He reached out and touched her cheek. "If after living with me, after discovering the reality of my nightmares and my flaws, you decided you could not bear this life, I wanted you to have the power to walk out the front door, not as a ruined woman, not as a beggar, but as a queen. I gave you the keys to the empire so you could see the cage, Serafina, and I gave you this trust so you would always hold the key to the lock." He had given her the ultimate proof of his respect. He had removed the financial chains of their era, offering her the terrifying, beautiful freedom to leave him. Serafina looked at the document. She looked at the man who had written it, a man of absolute uncompromising honor. She slid out of the bed, wrapping a heavy silk robe around her shoulders. She walked across the room to the marble fireplace, where the embers from last night's fire were still glowing red. She held the deed of trust over the grate. "Serafina, what are you doing?" Alistair asked, sitting forward. "That document is your security." "My security, but—" Serafina said, turning to look at him, her stormy eyes blazing with absolute conviction, "is sitting in that bed." She dropped the vellum into the embers. The dry paper caught instantly, flaring into a bright, brief column of yellow flame before crumbling into black ash. Alistair stared at the fire, entirely stunned. Serafina walked back to the bed. She climbed onto the mattress, straddling his lap, taking his harsh, scarred face between her hands. "I do not need an escape route, Alistair Montgomery," she whispered fiercely. "I am not a captive. I am your wife. I am your equal. And I am never, ever leaving your side. We build the empire together, or we burn it down together." Alistair looked into her eyes, the final lingering ghosts of his past evaporating into nothingness. He pulled her down, capturing her lips in a kiss that sealed their fate for the rest of their lives. The Iron Duke had finally found his match, and in her he had found his humanity. The Yorkshire autumn was a masterpiece of gold and crimson. The air was sharp, carrying the scent of pine needles and wood smoke. On the sweeping stone terrace of Ravenscroft Hall, Alistair Montgomery sat in a high-backed wooden chair. He was 39 years old, but he looked younger than he had the day he walked into White's Club. The lines of chronic stress had smoothed from his face. The cold, thousand-yard stare had been replaced by a watchful, grounded peace. On a small table beside him was a magnificent ivory and ebony chessboard. Standing opposite him, his chin barely reaching the edge of the table, was a 3-year-old boy with dark hair and piercing blue eyes. Arthur Montgomery, the Earl of Yorkshire, the heir to the empire. "You are overextending your cavalry, Arthur," Alistair said, gently tapping the board. "The knight is a powerful piece, but if you push him into the center without infantry support, he will be surrounded and destroyed. You must protect your flanks." The toddler frowned in intense concentration, his small fingers hovering over the carved ivory horse. "Like the aqueducts, Papa." Alistair let out a rich, deep laugh, the sound carrying across the lawns. "Exactly like the aqueducts. You never leave a structure vulnerable." The heavy glass doors of the terrace opened. Serafina stepped out into the autumn sunlight. She was 27, radiating a quiet, absolute authority. She wore a simple dress of forest green, her hair pulled back, completely at ease in her domain. In her arms, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, slept their second child, a daughter born just 2 months prior. Little Eleanor. Alistair stood instantly as she approached. He moved a chair for her, waiting until she was seated before he resumed his own place. It was a reflex of respect that had never faded, a daily reaffirmation of their partnership. "He is trying to sacrifice his queen for a quick checkmate," Alistair informed her, gesturing to the board. Serafina leaned over, analyzing the pieces with the same surgical precision she applied to the estate ledgers. She smiled. "He is trying to bait you, Alistair. Look at his bishop. If you take the queen, he has a clear diagonal to your king in 2 moves. Alistair blinked, analyzing the board again. He let out a low whistle. A trap, he said, a trap. He looked at the 3-year-old with immense pride. You have your mother's mom, God help the financial markets. Serafina laughed softly, adjusting the blanket around the sleeping infant. She looked out over the vast rolling expanse of the Ravenscroft estate. The northern mills were producing record yields. The syndicate that had threatened them was a forgotten memory. The board of directors had been purged and rebuilt with loyal, competent men. They had built an impenetrable fortress, not of stone, but of intellect, loyalty, and absolute trust. Alistair reached across the chessboard. He didn't move a piece. He placed his large, scarred hand over Serafina's. "What are you thinking about, my Duchess?" he asked quietly. Serafina looked at the man who had bought her debts, burned her father's markers, and handed her the keys to his world. She looked at their son, studying a chessboard, and their daughter sleeping safely in her arms. "I am thinking," Serafina said, her stormy eyes filled with a profound radiant light, "that the universe operates on a very strict ledger, Alistair. Sometimes it demands a terrible price from us. It takes our innocence in wars, or it strips away our illusions at gambling tables. But if we are strong enough to hold the line, if we are brave enough to demand justice instead of mercy," she turned her hand, lacing her fingers perfectly through his, "the universe eventually balances the accounts." Alistair smiled, the Iron Duke entirely conquered by the woman who held his heart. "It does," he agreed softly, "and we are infinitely in the black." He leaned over the chessboard and kissed her, a quiet, eternal promise beneath the Yorkshire sun. The game was over. They had won everything.